Hello, my name is Trent Stellingwerff, and I'm one of the Directors of Performance here at the Canadian Sport Institute Pacific in Victoria. I'm going to present to you a web recording of a presentation that was initially done at the Canadian Youth Sport Cross Country Championships this past November in London, Ontario. And it's about REDS, Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport Detection, Education, and Management for Athletes and Coaches. Before I jump into the I just wanted to highlight my amazing co-presenters and panelists and the three sponsors of the Female Athlete Program in Boston, Athletics Canada, and Backroads Brews and Shoes. As you can see here, I presented back in November with an amazing group of individuals, athletes, practitioners, physicians, and I especially like to thank Jane Thornton for her presentation, giving the general outline of what REDS is and isn't, and some of the diagnostic signs and symptoms. Today is going to look at two parts. One is why overtraining syndrome, or OTS, and REDS might look alike, just to add some clarity to coaches and athletes and practitioners around these two syndromes. And then secondly, I'm going to look at REDS through the lens of runners and look at runner-specific data, runner risks in severity and injuries and illnesses. So we'll start with energy availability and why overtraining and REDS might look alike. So as Jane mentioned in her general presentation on REDS, the underlying cause of REDS is low energy availability. And the equation for energy availability is a simple equation, but it's difficult to measure. So it's functionally energy intake minus exercise energy expenditure, corrected for fat-free mass or skeletal mass. So it only has two inputs, energy intake and the energy you expend during exercise, training, and competition. And so energy availability is the energy left over or available for the body to optimally recover, to adapt, for growth and development, for reproductive health. And obviously, if you don't have enough energy left over, elements like basal metabolic rate will start to slow down. You will compromise recovery, you'll compromise energetic turnover of bone, and a whole bunch of other elements. Obviously, optimal energy availability results in optimal health, training, and recovery profiles for desired adaptive responses. We'll talk a little bit more on that. Problematic low energy availability is when there's low energy availability, so you're not consuming enough for your given exercise, that is either very prolonged or severe. And it's problematic low energy availability that is the underlying etiology or cause for relative energy deficiency in sport, and is a key potential underappreciated confounder of overtraining syndrome. And indeed, because energy availability equation features both energy intake and exercise energy expenditure, then there is incredibly similar symptomology overlap. Both of these syndromes can present looking very much the same, but the cause of these two syndromes is different. So it is difficult to accurately measure energy availability. I've used this slide many times over in presentations. So although it is energy intake minus exercise energy expenditure, that is actually really challenging to measure in free living, free world conditions with athletes. Generally, we leave it to researchers who have better methods and skills to do this. But it's about as accurate as trying to measure rainfall and hurricane. Even trying to use a food app is incredibly inaccurate. And obviously, if you're out only 300 or 400 calories, if you multiply that by many days, it is a large amount of energy that an athlete might be out over months to years. So generally, energy availability is the cause of REDS, but we certainly do not endorse going out and trying to measure it unless you're working with kind of a trained professional. So coming back to overtraining and REDS, this is a recent review that a bunch of us penned actually during COVID. So if you're interested in this and you're a clinician that really wants to dive deep into the diagnostic similarities or differences between these two syndromes, I'll recommend this. But obviously the title really hits home around shared pathways, symptoms, and complexities. And with we do highlight this table, and I'll step you through this table. What we did with this table is we went out and looked for primary research papers and studies that the authors designated as either an overtraining paper or not, or functional overreaching or non-functional overreaching paper, or a REDS paper, according to what the authors of those papers really highlighted as the main study topical focus. So, either as a hypothesis or in the paper's title. Obviously, each paper has lots of different measurements and outcomes. And so what we did is looked at all the various outcomes that each paper showed. And some of them are going to be performance decrements, such as endurance, speed, injury, illness, training adaptations, or some might be health decrements, sex hormones, hematology, metabolic downregulation, bone injuries, or psychosocial, emotional. And what you can see here is across the board, whether the paper is an overtraining or REDS paper, they're all reporting similar performance outcomes or decrements as well as health decrement outcomes. Perhaps the one major difference is that most of the REDS or triad papers tend to focus more on deleterious bone outcomes, while overtraining papers do a little less. And so there's incredible symptom overlap, which makes it challenging to know what the right diagnosis is or isn't. And you definitely have to do a workup to look at eating behaviors and elements of energy intake. Also within this, we did a large analysis, so we found every single overtraining paper ever published that also tried to assess and measure energy intake or energy availability. We then did a bunch of calculations to look at whether or not, through the study design of overload of training, which is how overtraining studies are done, that will sometimes double training loads and look at outcomes, whether or not that was compensated with the same amount of dietary increase. And indeed, we found 21 papers, overtraining papers, that also had some assessment of energy intake or energy availability. But interestingly enough, 86% of those papers demonstrated directly or indirectly reduced energy availability, mainly via carbohydrate availability during the training overload period versus control. In other words, some of these papers were around prior to REDS or even existing or being coined as a term. And so it might make sense that perhaps the authors at that time didn't recognize that, in fact, by having a training overload without an increase in energy intake, it actually results in lowered energy availability, and therefore some or most of the cause of the outcomes of symptoms in these overtraining papers might actually be due to low energy availability, which again is the cause of REDS, not overtraining. So this area is confounded and complex, and I would encourage you, if interested in diagnoses and diagnostics, to have a look at that review paper I highlighted a few slides ago. All right, we'll now switch gears and talk a little bit about REDS and runner-specific outcomes. First of all, there are various sex-based differences in health and injury outcomes. And I think it's important as athletes and coaches to understand what some of those differences are and what some of the risk factors are that are different between male and female athletes. So first of all, this is BSIs, or stress fractures, bone stress injuries, per 100,000 athlete exposures. And the incidence of bone stress injuries in athletes, this is across the NCAA collegiate sports over a 10-year period. And an athlete exposure is one athlete in one practice or competition. So you can see the various NCAA sports. The blue bars are females, the yellow bars are males. And you can see sports like cross-country, gymnastics, and outdoor track being especially prevalent in stress fractures, or bone stress injuries is what we call. We can see females are sometimes double the amount of bone stress injuries than males. I have made some calculations to put this athlete exposure number into perspective. And basically, if you had a team of 20 male middle to long distance runners that did cross-country, indoor, and outdoor track, This incidence exposure rate would be something like 2 to 3 stress fractures per year in a team of 20 men, but it would be 5 to 6 bone stress injuries per year in a team of just 20 women. These are NCAA historical data. Obviously, it's important to think about this and track it within your own programs to understand and compare it to the norms that are out there to understand how many of these bone stress injuries are potentially preventable. Not all of them are, but I believe certainly many of them are through the approach of REDS prevention. Another area where there's sex-based differences are the fact that women have 4 times greater tendon rupture rate than men. This is a little bit more tenuous in terms of whether this is always shown in the literature or not. There is some hypotheses, although I wouldn't say it's completely confirmed, that during the first phase of the menstrual cycle, prior to ovulation, when estrogen is high, there might be an increased risk for tendon ruptures in females. That said, there's probably a whole bunch of psychosocial reasons as well. Right from when boys and girls are quite small, in many instances, little girls have they don't get the best coaches, they don't have the best support. Even our women's national team, soccer team, compared to men's soccer team, as an example, have a very different level of practitioners and support, whether they play on real grass or artificial turf. So there is certainly biological reasons for some of these sex-based differences in injury outcomes, but there's also potentially psychosocial reasons as well. So let's jump in a little bit in understanding sex-based differences in sport-specific risk factors. So this is a study done in about 800 competitive high school runners, so about 400 girls and 300 boys, where they followed them for the development of stress fractures prospectively over about a 2.5-year period. During that period, they found about 5% of the girls got a stress fracture and 4% of the boys got a stress fracture. They then looked back and did some questionnaires to look at what some of the risk factors were for those stress fractures. So on the female side of things, some of these numbers are basically your, your hazard ratios or your odds ratios of having a stress fracture if this variable is present. They did slightly different statistical approaches. I won't get too far in the weeds, but the highest risk factor at 5 to 6-fold greater incidence is a previous fracture history. So if your athletes have had stress fractures before, that is always a risk factor for future stress fractures. If you're a female that has previous participation in dance and gymnastics, you're 3 to 4-fold increased risk for subsequent stress fractures. If you have a body mass index under 19, if you've had late menarche, so late initial first period, 15 years or older, if you're currently amenorrheic, so if you currently do not have a menstrual cycle, and then the last major risk factor here is if you've had a prior or current diagnosis of an eating disorder, so anorexia or bulimia. The men's risk factors are less, but there are a few major ones that I'll highlight. Again, for males, high school males, a previous fracture history is important to notice. It is the by far the most or highest hazard or risk factor. Competition phase of the season is also a risk factor. And interesting for the males, plyometrics appear to be an increased risk factor for subsequent stress fractures. So obviously plyometrics on its own are a great exercise. I'm not at all dismissing the use of plyometrics, but in this instance, there might be inappropriate load biomechanical stress of plyometrics causing an increased risk for some bone stress injuries. This same paper then took all those risk factors and looked at the prospective percent risk of a stress fracture. Now, in some of these instances, the number of girls and boys that actually had the outcome is quite low. But as you can see on this side of the high school girls, the more risk factors you have, the more an increase chance you have of a prospective risk factor. The same type of outcome with the boys. So if you have 1 or 2 risk factors, you're going to be a lot more likely of having a prospective stress fracture over the next couple of years than if you've just got 0 or 1 risk factor. So looking at the accumulation of risk factors is also important. So again, as coaches or clinicians, for runners anyways, you can get a sense of some of those risk factors. And those risk factors, as you'll see in subsequent slides here, many of them are due to underfueling and low energy availability. This is a paper led by Dr. 𝗥𝗘𝗗𝘀, and a paper that I was involved with. In this study, we had 59 elite athletes, and they were very elite. 27% of them were 2016 Olympians that arrived up to Flagstaff, Arizona for a 3 to 4 week altitude training camp. Upon arrival to the training camp, in the first few days, we had a series of, we did a full REDS assessment, so blood tests and a DEXA scan for bone mineral density, plus some various questionnaires to look and assess at their current risk for REDS. Excuse me. One of the major outcomes that we found was that the 2 major leading symptoms and signs and symptoms of REDS is amenorrhea in a female, so lack of a menstrual cycle, and clinically or low testosterone in the lowest quartile for males. And these athletes, the females and the males that were either amenorrheic or had low testosterone, had 4.5 times the number of injury days due to bone stress injuries, stress fractures in their career. That is a very significant outcome, and one certainly to not ignore. And I just want to highlight that whether it's a female athlete triad or the relative energy deficiency in sports studies, when we look at the, and this is just part of the studies, all the studies, there is an overwhelming association between risk factors of REDS and triads, so underfueling, and adverse bone outcomes, whether it's bone mineral density or just straight up bone stress injuries and stress fractures. If anything in the literature, this is the association here is incredibly strong. And does it really matter? Does it matter to have a lot of bone stress injuries? A bone stress injury is one of the worst outcomes of REDS, primarily because it can take you out for 4, 6, sometimes 10 weeks. So it's a long injury profile. Secondly, in many instances, it is due to a compromised bone mineral density or bone structure. And that is actually something very slow to fix and to heal. In fact, if you've gone through puberty and you have low bone mineral density, you may have low bone mineral density for the rest of your career. But performance does matter, and athlete availability and lack of injuries matters a lot. So this is a great study done over 5 years in elite Australian track and field athletes. And basically what they did is they tracked injury in association with their goals. And you can see their goals are world championships and Olympics. And those that completed 80% of planned training weeks, so less than 80% of planned training weeks, were 7 times less likely to achieve their performance goals than the athletes that completed more than 80% of their planned training. So training availability and the availability to do the planned training, especially at greater than 80% of planned, is incredibly important to achieving your performance goals. Finally, maybe another shift on where and how low energy availability might impact on performance and outcomes. Obviously, having a lot of hemoglobin is important. Hemoglobin has been linked to VO2 max and endurance performance. Again, at our altitude training study, when we had female athletes arrive for that study, we had 22 that were eumenorrheic, so they had a normal menstrual cycle when they arrived to the training camp in Flagstaff. And we had 13 athletes that were amenorrheic, so did not have a normal or a menstrual cycle at all. We then measured their hemoglobin values, hemoglobin mass, using a technique called carbon monoxide rebreathe. It's a very sensitive way to measure hemoglobin and basically red blood cell mass. And we could see here that the eumenorrheic athletes had 8% greater hemoglobin mass when corrected for body weight than the amenorrheic athletes. 8% is a massive difference at baseline, and this was certainly significantly different. To put that 8% into perspective, I just went back to our database and looked at some of our elite athletes and females. With a typical training camp, so 3 to 4 weeks at altitude, we expect about a 6% increase in hemoglobin mass. So in this instance, athletes are spending thousands of dollars, to fly to Boulder, fly to Flagstaff, to rent accommodations, to have ground transportation, in the hopes of increasing hemoglobin by 5 or 6%. However, if you're just anemic, you're already 8% lower, regardless of the altitude effect. And obviously correcting amenorrhea, and there might be multifactorial reasons for this, but one huge treatment approach is increasing energy intake to restore energy availability. That then can eventually lead to a restoration of sex hormones and various other outcomes to help augment red blood cells and bone health and recovery, full stop. Although this isn't a track and field study, I did want to highlight this great piece of work in junior elite female swimmers. So they had 10 junior elite female swimmers aged 15 to 17, and half the athletes were categorized as cyclical, meaning they had a normally presenting natural menstrual cycle, and half were presented as ovarian suppressed. They were amenorrheic. They were evaluated every 2 weeks for metabolic hormones, bioenergetic parameters, and sport performance over the 12-week training season. So first of all, this graph, although it's small, is plotting both estrogen and progesterone on the same axis. And you can see in the cyclical athletes, every 4 weeks, there is a natural up and down, as you might expect, throughout the menstrual cycle for estrogen and progesterone, while here on the right is the ovarian suppressed group. There's no real changes at all throughout any of the cycles in estrogen and progesterone. Although it's hard to do, obviously these are researchers, so they did the best job they could to measure energy availability and energy balance. And so in energy balance, that's looking at all energy expenditure, including basal metabolic rate versus what you've taken in. You can see the cyclical athletes generally are in energy balance, so that's great. The ovarian suppressed athletes over the 12 weeks were at 500 to 800 caloric deficits from balance. They were underfueling by that much. Week in, day out, week in, week out over 12 weeks. They also looked at 400-meter swim velocity or speed. So the higher the velocity, the better the performance at both baseline and after 12 weeks. And as you can see here, 100% of the cyclical athletes, so the athletes with the normal menstrual cycle and the energy balance, got faster, while every single ovarian suppressed athlete got slower throughout that 12-week training camp. So again, the idea that you may not always see injuries, you may not always see body comp changes, but in many instances, training adaptation and performance outcomes can also be suppressed with markers and indicators of, in this instance, the female athlete triad and REDS. Finally, I just wanted to showcase an older study that sheds some light and data on what I think is a major misconception at times with athletes and coaches who want to put athletes into negative energy balance. So this was done in 62 elite female athletes. Many of these athletes were at the level of the World Championships or Olympics. And each one of these bars on this graph represent a different female athlete. You can see a group of artistic and rhythmic gymnasts, middle distance runners, and long distance runners. And again, through very strictly controlled research techniques, they looked at energy balance throughout the entire days of training. And on average, the artistic and rhythmic gymnasts here, you can see some of them being 400 to 600 calories in negative energy balance. The middle distance runners probably did the best job of trying to be right around balance, plus or minus 200 calories, versus the long distance runners who were fueling very well, maybe in some instances a little above energy balance. They also did body composition via the gold standard of DEXA, and very interestingly enough, if we look at some of those body composition outcomes, the leanest group is the group that was in an energy balance. So the middle distance runners was the leanest group. The group with the highest percent body fat are the group that are actually the furthest in negative energy balance. So in many instances, counterintuitive to what some people may hypothesize. However, there might be evolutionarily adaptation, evolutionary reasons for this. You know, as humans, we store body fat quite efficiently, especially during periods of famine. And if athletes are under fueling, it will send signals to the body that are very similar to situations of famine. And for me, it's not that surprising that the body is going to want to very efficiently store body fat for the future if an athlete is chronically under fueling. Here's a couple of quotes right from the paper. The number of hours with energy deficits greater than 300 calories is positively associated with body fat percentage. And so they quoted, thus dietary restriction resulting in energy intake below estimated energy needs should be avoided, not only because inadequate energy impairs performance, but also because increased deficits are associated with increased body fat. So again, a couple of messages perhaps that are counterintuitive to what a lot of athletes and coaches think. So I've added this section in. Where do I go for help? As obviously a diverse audience at this. First of all, I'll highlight that the Dietitians of Canada have a Find a Dietitian portal here. You can click on that, but always ask if they have experience with RED-S or eating disorders. And then the Canadian Sports Medicine Association, CASM, also has a Find a Sports Medicine physician as part of their website. But again, I would ask if they have experience with RED-S and eating disorders. I asked a couple of physicians about their advice in this area, and here's a quote from one physician that I think is really great. I think the education and awareness component is very important because most MDs, including family doctors and many OB/GYNs, are not familiar with RED-S. In most cases, if a coach is worried about this, the usual starting point is with the athlete's family doctor or a pediatrician. However, because not all MDs may be familiar with RED-S, it would be helpful if the coach or parent has an information resource to give to the athlete to bring to the appointment. So that could be something like, hey, you know, I have these signs and symptoms, these symptoms of RED-S. Could it be RED-S? My coach and I were looking, here's the brand new International Olympic Committee consensus statement on RED-S. And this physician went on to say, I always try to get a dietitian involved as well. Many extended benefit plans will cover RD services. If not, they can add up quickly if not covered. I'll also highlight these psychological resources. So the top there is the Canadian Sports Psychology Association, so you can find a consultant. The middle is Body Sense. That is a website promoting positive body image in sport. It is currently being reconstructed, I believe, by the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, and we'll have a relaunch in 2024. I would strongly suggest education for coaches and parents and athletes around promoting positive body image in sport, what you say, how you structure your environment, even small things around whether the athlete looks lean or mean. Don't say that. Promote their performance, but don't promote their performance through words around body shape and body image. And then finally at the bottom, the National Eating Disorder Information Center. So definitely some resources here to lean into. And then finally, just in 2023, the International Olympic Committee has launched a brand new 9-paper consensus on RED-S. It has a lot of Canadians involved in this. So you can click on that and find more resources, including the overall consensus statement, including editorials and including the new diagnostic tool. And then I'll also highlight where I work at the Canadian Sport Institute Pacific. We have sport education on demand, and there's a huge amount of free content there, videos, webinars, on all topics, including REDS, and you can search for more information there. So with that, we'll finish up with a short. Here are some of the more routine indicators relevant for athletes and coaches and parents to look out for REDS and poor energy availability. The ones that I've listed in blue are symptoms that every athlete, coach, or parent can help to identify. The ones in black are ones that a physician usually needs to assess. So for example, in blue, a primary, secondary, or 𝘮𝘢𝘬𝘮𝘬𝘬𝘮, so menstrual cycle status changes. If you have a lack of a menstrual cycle or less than 9 cycles in the last 12 months, that is definitely a sign and a symptom to look out for. If we move down, 2 or more career stress fractures is also a sign and a symptom. If we move down again, symptomatic orthostatic intolerance caused by very low heart rate and blood pressure. Obviously, those are somewhat easier to measure. And symptomatic orthostatic intolerance tends to be getting really dizzy when rising up from bed or from sitting down. It is very low blood pressure and heart rate, so it can be situations of passing out during hard efforts. I'll add on very consistent training, ups and downs of training, and high levels of fatigue, poor or decreasing sex drive, and constantly striving to be thin year-round or major dietary changes can also be signs and symptoms of low energy availability or REDS. But I want to stress every single one of these items also has a potential differential cause that may not be due to underfueling. So the more that you accumulate in this list, the more likelihood you have a definitive diagnosis. Some of the more technical outcomes that require blood work or a DEXA scan include low testosterone, bone mineral density, Z-score under -1, low T3, which is a blood biomarker that looks at thyroid, and or elevated total or LDL cholesterol, and then elevated eating disorder examination questionnaire scores, as well as elevated anxiety and or depression. Those are other elements that need more of a clinical evaluation, but can add to the certainty of a poor energy availability. Finally, our amazing sports registered dietitian across the Canadian Sport Institute network have produced this 5 tips for managing energy availability. I'll go through them quite quickly. Elements of, if you're a hard training athlete, you need to think about eating every 3 to 4 hours. So you got to plan and think about snacks. You got to think about eating around training, before, during, and after training. And most specifically, I would target carbohydrate around training. Obviously, eating to match your training volume. Many young athletes throughout high school will sometimes even double or triple what they've done compared to grade 8 or 9. And therefore, they need to think about doubling and tripling the size of their plate. Planning ahead. If you're a busy student athlete, the logistics of your training day and week can be quite hectic. So you need to think about pre-packed foods and snacks. Advanced planning is required. And then if you're having issues, obviously working with a sport dietitian can be very impactful and helpful in this space. And then finally, I'll show the same graph that I showed at the end of the USport cross-country presentation. And I just wanted to really highlight that a lot of talent comes from the USports. This is a graph that I've put together over the last 6 years, examining our middle and long distance runners at the world and Olympic level. So what athletes are making the teams? We'll start here on the right and look at the percent of Canadian female university athletes that are making our team. In the last 3 years, 80% of Athletics Canada's world and Olympic team are Canadian female university athletes. And 80% of those athletes are coached by Canadian coaches. The men's story is a little different. The number of percent of athletes that are coming from a Canadian university on our major games team is 40 to 45%, but 60 to 65% of the men on those university or on our world and Olympic teams are coached by a Canadian coach. And so there is a lot of talent, especially on the women's side, that comes through the U Sport programs. The majority of our major games teams in running, it's not necessarily true in other events, but in middle to long distance running, especially on the female side, come through Canadian universities. And so the U Sport is really doing a great job at generating and being patient in generating talent through the U Sport program. So with that, I'll thank you very much, and thank you for listening to this presentation. Have a great day.